And so we've had these heartfelt reminders, as I said, from Shinzan last week and from Roshi Enkyo on Zoom from New York a few days ago. And she reminded us that prajna, as in the Prajna Paramita Heart Sutra, means before knowing or knowledge. No, but it's just I can hear myself reminding myself from the computer. It's perfect. Thank you, Emmanuel, for all the technical details. So Roshi Enkyo, as you may remember, as I'm remembering, was saying that prajna means before knowing, before knowledge, this prajna and prajna paramita. And she asked us to consider, where were we before knowing? Where were you before knowing? And she reminded us that we're all part of this whole vast world, and that when we see our being this way, we naturally take care of the whole world as ourselves. This is the Bodhisattva way of seeing the world. And then Roshi Norman Fisher joined us from what looked like his office / Zendo, and which I imagine is right down the hall from Sensei Kathy Fisher's office / Zendo. And we had this joy of seeing the two practice periods like adjacent to each other, the everyday Zen practice period, which started on the same day, and the Upaya practice period. And I imagine this like portal of a hallway between the two, where these two infinite fields of practice like magically meet and intertwine. So that's my vision of the house they live in. Norman reminded us also, and he reminded us that to hold on to a fixed truth is to limit the freedom and love that pervades this world. And that prajna paramita means we can't really grasp or know the truth anyway, but that we can love the truth even if we don't know it. That was great. He said, everyone without exception is expressing the truth. And then he gave us the cliff notes of the entire Lotus Sutra, which is a lot longer than the Heart Sutra, as many of you know, and which Everyday Zen is studying for their practice period, and which of course is empty of a Lotus Sutra. So basically the Heart Sutra. So now I get to give a Dharma talk tonight. And as I just mentioned, the last person to give a Dharma talk was Roshi Norman Fisher, and the person before that was Roshi Enkyo. And tomorrow it's gonna be Stephen Batchelor. And there are these like marquee names in Buddhism. Hi, my name's Kozan. And I've had a little bit of trepidation about giving the talk tonight, to be honest. But also, to be honest, I get this every time I give a Dharma talk, which I think I was talking to Shoryu about yesterday. I get this like the Dharma talk jitters. And usually I like tell people about this a great deal. And it goes something like this. I'm feeling way behind in my writing. My thoughts are all jumbled up. I'm not sure they're gonna come together. And I'm really worried that somehow I'm gonna lead people astray and this is just gonna be horrible. And so usually I kvetch to whomever's nearby. And last year, before maybe my first or maybe the second Dharma talk of practice period, which was also with Shinzan and Kathy, it was Kathy who was nearby. And we were in the faculty office, which is right outside the Zendo. I was putting on my Okesa. And while putting on my Okesa, probably I was like, I'm so sorry. This is gonna be a real train wreck. Like I apologize beforehand. And Kathy, without missing a beat, said, oh, that would be so refreshing. She really meant it. And it was this tiny, priceless gift of fearlessness. But most of the time, Noah's nearby, because he always seems to be nearby. And he patiently and caringly kind of listens as I kvetch about how my Dharma talk's gonna be a mess. And last time I gave a talk, I did this with him, I think at some length. I think I was over at his house for dinner or something, and I was really getting into it. And I just said, I should never do this again, and I'm so sorry. And then after the talk, he came up to me kind of angry, a little gruff. He doesn't really get angry. He was probably jovial, but like angry for Noah. And he said, I'm fed up. I think you were trying to mean it. And he said, you're not allowed to complain to me anymore. That's it. That was the last time. Apparently the talk was okay. I'd set him up for this train wreck that never happened. So I've had no one to kvetch to, thanks to Noah, and I've just been stuck noticing this habit of fear. What is there to be afraid of anyway? And so in the spirit of turning into the skid, I thought we'd talk about fear tonight. This kind of small bore fear, this kind of quotidian fear that comes up maybe often, and the big fears, the fears about the state of the world and the state of our place in the world. And I feel for some reason like we don't talk about fear very often. Maybe it's just another word for suffering, but it's a different lens. And so this was interesting to me, that the second it came up and I noticed it in the Heart Sutra, it seemed to be this basic thing we all share that's so central to the human experience. And maybe it starts for us as children over and against us, and we feel like we're constantly in a state of protection from threat. And where does the threatening, fearful force come from? Fearful force come from by others who are fearful, and their internal fears being externalized, and then those externalized fears being internalized, and then those internalized. You get the gist, and there's just this great ball of fear that we call the world. And of course, the state of things right now makes it really easy to talk about fear. I don't really have to say any of this because it's so apparent in our world right now. But I think saying it reminds us that we're in this ridiculous state together. Like this is all happening to all of us. So just as a reminder, we're in a pandemic. It's still happening. That's true. Which has killed over 1 million people so far and infected many others who will have probably lasting effects from the illness. And some of us know people who are getting sick. Some have relatives who are getting sick. We don't know what's going to happen to them. Some of us know people who died in hospital quarantine who haven't been able to have those they love by their side. Along with that, there's a militarized police force, which we've had for some time, but seems impervious to attempts at reform, and a broken criminal justice system. And then there's fears about the structural stability of our government, which I think a lot of us share, and the mental stability of those charged with leading our government, and the fear of the future of our planet, which right now is embodied by these fires that are raging across the West Coast. They're also raging in Brazil and Indonesia and elsewhere. So the world's quite literally on fire. We're in a pandemic. And if usually you're like, I don't have fear, like this is the time, you're like, okay, I can have some fear about things. Like these are the kind of things one generally has some trepidation about. And then there's the closer to home fears that always seem to be part of our life. Whether we're going to be a good friend today, or whether we're going to get through our to-do list and thus become decent and responsible people, whether we're going to be respected by those we respect and loved by those we love, or more importantly, as previously stated, whether we'll give a decent Dharma talk today. All these fears may be alive for us. And so a question I have is, what are these, and I've had this week, or just what are these fears made of? And where do they come from? Where do they arise from for us? And so for a moment, I just want you to consider if you encountered fear in your day, in your life, in your body. Did you encounter fear today? Bring it up. Any fear. What was it comprised of? What did it feel like? Was it a familiar fear? Was it a new fear? Was it subtle or blunt? Looking back, did the fear seem useful or was it a hindrance? Did it separate you from your life or help you cook your life, or did it do both? Okay, so keep that memory with you as we kind of explore fear. And I want to acknowledge that maybe some people didn't. Maybe, like me, fear isn't a word that you associate with emotions, or fear hides in the guise of other things, like depression or anger or pride, these other terms that we talk about more often in our Buddhist discussions. And I'm going to suggest, and I think the Heart Sutra suggests, that fear is always there with it in some form. So I want to see if we can coax fear out of the shadows, we can trace its origins. And I'm really thinking of this because of this kind of penultimate section of the Heart Sutra just before the Gatha, where it reads, without attainment, bodhisattvas take refuge in prajnaparamita and live without walls of the mind. This is the Red Pine translation. Without walls of the mind, and thus without fears. Let me read that again. Without attainment, bodhisattvas take refuge in prajnaparamita and live without walls of the mind. Without walls of the mind, and thus without fears. So this seems to be a kind of radical thing. The sutra seems to be telling us that when we take refuge in prajnaparamita, in wisdom beyond wisdom, in emptiness or boundlessness, the walls of the mind dissolve. Separation dissolves. And fear dissolves right along with it. But how? So I want to start back with where the Heart Sutra starts, which is early Buddhism. And in early Buddhism, we're given the Four Noble Truths. And there's suffering, the first noble truth, and the cause of suffering is desire, the second noble truth. And mainly this desire is described in kind of sensual ways to begin with, hunger and thirst, lust. And as the discussion progresses through the centuries, it becomes more subtle. Instead of sensual desire, the second noble truth begins to address a question of a kind of deeper, unconscious desire for things to be graspable, to be havable, to be solid and enduring. And in this case, we have suffering because we want things to be stable. We want them to be havable. And in this way, we're under this conception that we want to be a kind of hoarder of things, that we might be protected and thus not have fear. So this is the kind of immortal dragon vision where we're surrounded by a world's worth of treasure and relics and wisdom, and we're sleeping safely because we're the world's largest creature and we have scales that can protect us from anything, and we're surrounded by having conquered all that's worth conquering, all things that might create fear. And so basically in this conception, we're all role-playing gamers playing the biggest game of Dungeons and Dragons that you've ever seen. And to win, we become the dragon who owns all things. But of course, nothing is havable in this way. Not youth, not safety, not other people, not riches. So essentially in this reading, our suffering is the need for things to be other than they actually are. We keep thinking everything is separate and finite and fixed, when really it's inseparably sewn together in one flow endlessly throughout time. So that when we point at any one thing, we're also pointing at everything. When we fully appreciate one thing in this moment, we're also appreciating the whole universe in all moments. That's the great result. So this boundless view, or this emptiness view, turns out to be kind of terrifying to our ego. The sense of I, me, mine is threatened when there's no boundaries to define what's me or what's mine. And so we turn away and take cover in a more limited, manageable, make-believe space that we can feel safe in. This is the opposite of being in a giant layer with all the world's stuff. And we construct what the Heart Sutra calls walls of the mind, a castle to protect us and separate us, to create the illusion that we're distinct and solid and safe. We often call the building blocks of these walls the three poisons, as I said, so greed and anger and delusion. And of course, this castle is just a sandcastle. Maybe it's full scale, maybe it's huge, maybe it's Camelot. Maybe for some of us, it's even bigger than Camelot. It's just complex and intricate and maze-like. But it's a sandcastle, nonetheless. The walls are as unsubstantial and empty of solidity as any other thing. The tide of time effortlessly dissolves them with each moment and with each breath. So we constantly build them back up. And this is the part I'm interested in. That if they're sandcastles, and they're so easily swept away by the tide, we need to put in a lot of effort to keep our walls erected, these walls of the mind. And where does all that effort come from? So this is where I think fear comes in. Even when this separateness that we erect with anxiety and greed and envy and these poisons we talk about, even when it doesn't feel cozy anymore, even when it feels oppressive, we go back to the activity of erecting the walls that we're used to. And this is where it seems necessary to have an inexhaustible engine of our sandcastle-making factory of the mind. So when we notice these walls as manifestations of the three poisons, we can also notice that fear is somewhere around them, giving rise to them. So here's the three poisons. Everyone knows the three poisons. So the first is greed. Anyone feel greed? Greed ever? So when you feel greed, maybe bring to mind a sense of feeling greed. What fear may be associated with it? Loss? Loss. What else? Control. Loss of control. Anything else? Grief. So we often say that the three poisons are kind of all within one another. Maybe there's just one poison. We call it delusion. Sometimes we talk about five poisons. So I think these fears are going to be a little interchangeable, but just to keep with the rubric that we like to have sometimes, I'm going to suggest there are different fears associated with different poisons. Well, you really just named all three. So my understanding of greed, I take maybe the greed for fame or admiration. Dogen talks about name and gain. So name being fame and gain being riches. So we can look at either of them. But the fear that maybe drives our fame or the want for admiration may be driven from a sense that we're not loved or lovable unless we're publicly praised or have some sort of social cachet. And then for wealth, our greed for wealth maybe is underlined with a fear that we won't be safe unless we're fortified by excesses, by more. This is kind of the dragon fear. And so maybe beneath greed is always the concise fear that who we are is not enough, that this life isn't enough. Anyone with me on that one? Two people are really with me. Okay, so that's maybe how we could think about the first poison. The second poison, anger. Anything different come up around the fear that may arise with anger? Pain. Yeah, you stub your toe, you get angry. Isn't that weird? Helplessness. Also loss of control. Well, I think of angers that arise on a kind of big scale for me and a small scale. So on a big scale, I might think of climate change and anger at people who seem to not want to do anything about climate change. And this anger is really interesting in that it's, for me, not a fear of loss of life, of my life. That seems so far out. But a fear that the world, a just world, a kind world, a harmonious world that I can imagine is being ruined by someone else's fears. That someone else's fears and desires are controlling the world we're going to be in. And that's terrifying. So it's a bit of loss of control. And then there's the close to home one for me, which I thought of Willow the other day. We have to talk about Willow at some point, who's my dog. And she usually comes when I say come, unless Shoryu's nearby, in which case there's not a chance. But Shoryu wasn't anywhere to be seen, and we were not so far from the road, and a car was coming, and I said, come. And instead she ran towards the road. And I was like suddenly livid, like, Willow, come. Terrified she was going to be run over by a car. And she finally came, and I'm like, don't you know that you could have been run over by a car, Willow? And Willow's like, like really thrilled with herself. And my anger is like fully present. I'm like, how could you? And so for me, this has to do, like, this poison just so clearly has to do with the fear of loss of life, the fear of loss of control. And then we have the third poison, delusion. This is a hard one. Anyone have thoughts about delusion? Anyone online want to type them? Noah will read them out, but maybe we're on YouTube, so that's hard. Any fears that arise with delusion? Living a life completely unknowing that you've been doing it wrong. Fear that you've been doing it wrong. That's really interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Noah says disconnect from what is real, and I'm not as smart as I think I am. I think these were from people watching online. So all of those, I think, are woven together and come from a similar source. And I think delusion is truly like the squirreliest of the three and the hardest to kind of pin down. And that's actually maybe the feeling of it. And so I think, as I suggested before, this has to do with the desire for things to be other than they are. In other words, the fear that this is it. That might be a really interesting fear. That this body, this mind, this breath is exactly as it appears. Simple and mundane, vast and inescapable, and that's terrifying. And so you want to check out, or you want to go elsewhere. You want to escape, as you said. And often this is associated with addiction, that this is the fear associated with going elsewhere, building another world that is manageable and that is different. And attempts with addiction like substance use or conflict or food or social media, which is big right now, to make the ego so big and engrossing that the world beyond ourselves becomes smaller and less threatening, or at least seems so. And this, I think, is the hard wiring that's kind of in us that's so readily hacked right now by a world of coders and hucksters seducing us towards social media rabbit holes and clickbait and conspiracy theories, that these are portals away from the infinite unknowable state of things here that we sit with on the cushion and into something finite and graspable. Can we make the world graspable? Okay, so those are the three. That's my first attempt at locating the fears that actually are associated with our poisons. So what? Maybe merely that fear is often lurking there is enough for us to notice. Lurking in the background, pretending to be something else. That what keeps us from being ourselves is paradoxically the fear of being ourselves. A fear of allowing the self to be itself, just by itself. Boundless, connected, free. And so how do we practice with this? One approach might be to develop inner courage to overcome our fears. If fear leads to suffering, then the path out of suffering is won by seeing fears clearly, weeding them out, and eventually conquering them. That way we might finally be free of the havoc of fear and the havoc of suffering. And on one level, this seems absolutely our task. This is why we develop discipline and patience, why we're mindful not to sow seeds of fear in ourselves and others through our conduct, and why we develop wisdom to see clearly how best to do this. But, as you've probably guessed, from the perspective of the Heart Sutra, from the perspective of Prajnaparamita, from boundlessness, this way won't do at all. The Heart Sutra comes along and says, no suffering, no origination, no cessation from suffering, no path, no eightfold path, no threefold path of Shila, Samadhi, and Prajna. So no surmounting desire, and thus conquering the fear of not having what we want. So this emptiness, this Prajnaparamita, really throws a wrench in things, or to be more accurate, throws a non-real wrench into nothing, which I think has the same effect. So to say that anything could be attained, including courage, which we could then use to overcome fear, would be to say that it's fixed, that it's separate, that it's a thing that could be cognized and understood and possessed. And the Heart Sutra is telling us in this one fell swoop, in this kind of single-minded reformation, that nothing in the taxonomy of our experience actually works the way we think it works. Not the 5 aggregates that we've gone through, not the 18 dhatus, which we've gone through, not the 12 causal links. All of it doesn't work that way. And so here's what it says again. Without attainment, bodhisattvas take refuge in Prajnaparamita and live without walls of the mind. Without walls of the mind, and thus without fears. And here's our translation of Upaya. Boundlessness is free of attainment. Being free of attainment, those who help all to awaken, abide in the realization of wisdom beyond wisdom, and live with an unhindered mind. Without hindrance, the mind has no fear. So instead of attaining the courage to overcome our fears, the Heart Sutra suggests we do the complete opposite. It invites us to let go of our codependent relationship to attainment, and thus to stop feeding the cycle of grasping that's the engine of our fears. We just stop building the sandcastle. Avalokiteshvara, in her Great Compassion, says, let go of attainment. Let go of dividing the world up between right and wrong, true and false, us and them, having and not having. Let go of anything to have courage over and against, and so let go of constructing anything to be afraid of. No matter what is going on, you are it is you. There's no inside, there's no outside. Nothing to change or prevent. Which reminds me of most Zen teachings, since most Zen teachings are talking in some way about prajnaparamita, but most about this wonderful quote from Master Hongzhi, where he says, not a single atom opposes you. Not a single atom in the whole world opposes you. What a feeling. But I'm kind of skeptical. Can't help it. So my question is this really possible? I mean, really, really possible. I think, okay, we can have that experience of freedom, of fearlessness, but can we live it every moment of every day completely in our lives? And this is where I think of the phrase John Donne brought us via a Sangha, which is this kind of potent and instructive quote. He says, wisdom is what keeps us out of samsara, and compassion is what keeps us out of nirvana. Wisdom is what keeps us out of samsara, and compassion is what keeps us out of nirvana. So with wisdom, we become free of fear, and with compassion, we remember our relative life in this human body and all its fallibility and intimacy. It's only natural that we don't want to die. It's only natural that we don't want to feel pain or lose loved ones. So perhaps by developing a felt sense of prajnaparamita, or coursing in the course of wisdom, as we translate it, over time and with practice, a felt sense of boundlessness within the boundaries of our body, we feel our fears without them shaking us to the core. Existential dread doesn't take hold. We feel fear, but maybe it's closer to the surface. A true and actual human feeling at the surface with a deep calm and fearlessness underneath. And this kind of embodied fearlessness is said to be the greatest of gifts. Maybe you all know this. I like to remind the people. But there are three kinds of dhanaparamita. The first, perfection. The first is worldly goods, like food and riches. The second is to give dharma, which is even better. And the third, the utmost gift, is the gift of fearlessness. It's kind of embodied fearlessness, which we learn in the Heart Sutra is also the gift of prajnaparamita. So luckily for us, this gift of prajnaparamita is kind of wrapped up and given to us at the end of the Heart Sutra. You know, we get this line about fearlessness, and then the authors of the Heart Sutra get very excited about the final bit, the sutra, and they tell us that it's a magical incantation, which I believe it is. I believe the whole Heart Sutra actually is like a magical incantation. Reminds me of Om Mani Padme Hum. And the Heart Sutra is already condensed, and they're like, well, the really condensed version of this incantation is actually just here, this last line. So take this. This is what you can come back to when you feel fear. And the mantra, which I don't know how much we've gone into yet, is often translated as gone, gone. Completely gone to the other shore, gone all the way to the other shore together, awakening, joy. I like this translation. Gate, gate, paragate, parasangate, bodhi, svaha. But the word gate has the root gam, and the root gam in Sanskrit and in Pali is to go, and it's also to arrive. So you can invert the sutra, you can invert that final line, and it can mean arriving. So that way it sounds a little different. This is sometimes how Koz translates it. It's arriving, arriving, arriving all the way together. Hallelujah. This is this little talisman of freedom, of fearlessness, of prajnaparamita that we're given in this Heart Sutra by Avalokiteshvara. So I want to end with a poem that Dogen quotes from his teacher in his fascicle on the Heart Sutra, which we actually didn't put in the reader, but if anyone has Dogen's work, it's really worth reading while we're studying the Heart Sutra. And it's often the second fascicle in the Shobogenzo. And so Dogen says, Rujing, my late master, old Buddha, said, the entire body is a wind bell hanging in empty space. Regardless of the wind from the east, the west, the south, or the north, joining the whole universe in chiming out prajna. Ting, tong, ting, tong, ting, tong. The entire body is prajna, Dogen says. The entire other is prajna. The entire self is prajna. The entire east, west, south, and north is prajna. So we're preparing for Sesshin, all of us together, which I really look forward to sitting with everyone. And no matter what winds life brings during the Sesshin, I hope we all practice like wind bells, open and fearless, right in the middle of our fears, allowing the whole of our life to sound out freedom in each moment. That'd be nice. Thanks, everyone.